She whispered, "It hurts when I sit." The town looked away, but one man believed her. In the dusty settlement of Dustwood Creek, where secrets festered like wounds in the desert heat, a 19-year-old girl's pain became the town's shame. Her name was Rose Harper, and she lived under the protection of the most respected man in town, Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield. But when a silent blacksmith named William Stone noticed what everyone else chose to ignore, a reckoning was coming that would shake the very foundations of their carefully built lives. This is the story of courage found in whispers, justice born from silence, and the truth that no amount of prayer could wash away. You're about to witness how one man's refusal to look away changed everything. Not just for Rose, but for an entire community that had forgotten the difference between faith and fear. Stick around, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths, and sometimes it takes just one person to believe for the whole world to change. The town of Dustwood Creek woke slow and dusty under the faded gold of a New Mexico morning. Church bells hadn't rung yet, but the scent of cornbread and heat hung in the air like a curtain of silence. The adobe buildings huddled together along Main Street like old men sharing secrets, their walls bleached white by years of unforgiving sun. Dust devils danced between the buildings, stirring up memories and regrets in equal measure. At the edge of the chapel's courtyard, Rose Harper stood with her arms full of heavy kitchen pots, her frame small beneath the weight. She was 19, but she moved like someone twice her age, careful, quiet, avoiding sudden steps like they might betray her. Her dress, once blue but now faded to the color of old sky, hung loose on her thin frame. The fabric was patched in 3 places, mended with thread that didn't quite match, telling the story of a life lived on the margins of other people's charity. The morning air carried the sound of awakening, roosters crowing from behind weathered fences, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of windmills turning lazily in the desert breeze. But there was something else in that air, something heavier than the promise of another scorching day. It was the weight of things left unsaid, of truths buried deeper than the town's foundations. Inside the church kitchen, the preacher's wife barked orders while wiping flour from her apron. Constance Thornfield was a woman built for giving orders. Tall, angular, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. The women preparing Sunday supper were loud and quick with judgment, their voices rising and falling like a flock of harsh-voiced birds. "Sister Margaret, those biscuits need more salt," Constance commanded, not looking up from her own work. "And Sister Ruth, mind that you don't let the beans burn again like last week. The Lord expects better from his servants." The women scattered like startled chickens, each afraid to be the next target of Constance's sharp tongue. But Rose moved around them all like a ghost, saying nothing, touching nothing more than she had to. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor, though even that protection had its limits. When she crouched to stack firewood near the stove, she winced. Barely a breath, barely a sound, but it was enough. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a flower closing its petals against an approaching storm. But pain has its own language, and those who have spoken it recognize its dialect in others. One of the older women, Sister Abigail, paused as she passed behind her. Sister Abigail had buried 3 husbands and raised 7 children, and she prided herself on knowing the business of everyone in Dustwood Creek. Her eyes, small and quick like a sparrow's, missed nothing, or so she believed. "Why you moving like a colt with a sore leg, child?" she asked, her voice carrying just loud enough for the other women to hear. There was something in her tone that suggested she already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it spoken aloud, like a child picking at a scab. Rose stood up slowly, her movements careful and measured. When she spoke, her voice was dry as autumn leaves. "It hurts when I sit." Just that. A whisper. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. For a moment the kitchen fell silent, except for the bubble of beans in the pot and the distant sound of children playing in the street. The other women exchanged glances, quick, darting looks that said more than words ever could. Sister Abigail's face shifted, rearranging itself into an expression of forced cheerfulness. Her smile was too wide, too practiced, like a mask worn so long it had forgotten the face beneath. "Well, maybe if you didn't slouch so much," she said, her voice bright with false concern. "A lady should carry herself with proper posture. Ain't that right, Constance?" Constance looked up from her work, her pale eyes settling on Rose with the weight of judgment. "The girl's always been delicate," she said, as if Rose weren't standing right there. "Some people are just born to suffer more than others. It builds character." The other women murmured their agreement, nodding like sunflowers following the sun. They went back to their chatter, their voices rising again to fill the uncomfortable silence. No one asked what Rose meant. No one wanted to know. In Dustwood Creek, there were questions that polite people simply didn't ask, truths that decent folks chose not to see. Rose returned to her work, gathering the heavy pots and carrying them outside to scrub at the pump behind the chapel. The stone steps were her responsibility, had been since she was 15 and first came to live with the Thornfields. She knelt on the worn limestone, her knees finding the familiar grooves worn smooth by years of devout knees and desperate prayers. The lye soap burned her hands, already raw from a morning of hauling water and scrubbing floors. Her dress soaked through from the knees down, the water cold against her skin despite the warming day. Each time she shifted her weight, each time she had to adjust her position, she winced. The pain was constant now, a dull ache that had become as much a part of her daily existence as breathing. She worked alone as the town buzzed to life around her. Men in dusty work clothes loaded wagons with supplies, their voices carrying jokes and complaints in equal measure. Women in faded calico dresses hurried between the general store and the post office, their children trailing behind like ducklings. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and horses stamped their feet at the hitching posts, eager to be moving again. But no one stopped to speak to Rose. No one offered her water, though the sun was climbing higher and the day was growing hot. No one asked why a young woman was scrubbing stone steps on her knees before most decent folks had finished their breakfast. She had become invisible, a piece of the landscape, as unremarkable as the weathered wood of the chapel or the dust that coated everything in Dustwood Creek. Across the road, under the deep shadow of the blacksmith's awning, a man watched. William Stone leaned against the post that supported his forge's roof, his broad shoulders filling out a work shirt that had seen better days. His face was carved from leather and time, etched with lines that spoke of years spent squinting into fire and smoke. His beard was peppered with gray, and his hands, even at rest, bore the permanent stains of his trade. But it was his eyes that set him apart from other men. They were still, patient, like deep water, that reflected everything but revealed nothing of what lay beneath. He had been watching Rose for weeks now, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Something about the way she moved, the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate a world full of hidden dangers. Something about the way she held herself, like a bird with a broken wing trying to fly without showing the damage. William Stone was a man of few words, and those words had grown fewer still since the fever took his wife and daughter 15 years ago. The townspeople respected him for his skill with iron and fire, but they also kept their distance. There was something unsettling about a man who could spend days without speaking, who seemed to hear things that others missed, who watched with eyes that saw too much. Their eyes met across the dusty street, Rose's and William's, just for a moment. Hers were the color of winter sky, gray and endless, holding depths that a 19-year-old shouldn't possess. His were dark brown, patient as stone, giving nothing away. The connection lasted only a heartbeat before Rose looked away, returning to her scrubbing with renewed intensity. But William didn't move. He stayed there, leaning against his post, watching as the girl worked her way methodically across the chapel steps. He saw how she favored her left side, how she bit her lip when she thought no one was looking, how her hands shook slightly when she reached for the scrub brush. He had seen that kind of pain before. The memory came unbidden, as memories often do when they're least wanted. His daughter Rose, his Rose, had moved like that once, after she'd fallen from the apple tree behind their cabin. She'd been too proud to cry, too brave to complain, but William had seen the careful way she walked, the way she caught her breath when she thought he wasn't looking. He'd carried her to the doctor in Santa Fe, riding through the night with her small body pressed against his chest, feeling her heart beat like a butterfly trapped in his hands. But this Rose, This grown woman, scrubbing steps in the morning sun, had no one to carry her anywhere. As the morning wore on, people began to gather for the early service. They arrived in their Sunday best, despite it being only Wednesday. Reverend Thornfield held prayer meetings 3 times a week, and attendance was expected, not optional. The men wore their cleanest work clothes and their least battered hats. The women had pinned their hair in neat buns and smoothed the wrinkles from their one good dress. Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield emerged from the chapel like a man stepping into his kingdom. He was tall and lean, with silver hair that caught the morning light and a voice that could carry to the back of any congregation. His black suit was perfectly pressed, his white collar crisp as fresh paper. When he smiled, which he did often, his teeth were straight and white as tombstones. He was, by all accounts, a good man. He had brought the word to Dustwood Creek when it was nothing more than a trading post and a few scattered homesteads. He had baptized their children, buried their dead, and married their young. He had built the chapel with his own hands, laying stone upon stone until it stood as a testament to faith in a land that tested faith daily. He was also the man who owned Rose Harper. When the Reverend saw Rose still scrubbing the steps, his smile widened. "Diligence is a virtue, child," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being heard. "The Lord rewards those who serve without complaint." Rose didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just continued scrubbing, her movements steady and methodical as a machine. "She's a blessing," Constance Thornfield said, appearing at her husband's elbow like a shadow given form. "So grateful for the roof we've provided, aren't you, Rose?" Still, Rose said nothing. But William Stone, watching from across the street, saw her shoulders tense like a cat preparing to run. The congregants filed into the chapel, their voices creating a low murmur of community and shared purpose. Children were hushed, babies were bounced, and the older women compared notes on whose rheumatism was acting up and whose son was courting which neighbor's daughter. Rose finished the steps just as the last of the congregation disappeared inside. She gathered her cleaning supplies with the efficiency of long practice, wringing out the rags and pouring the dirty water into the dust where it made dark patches that would be gone within the hour. When she stood to go inside, William saw her pause, one hand pressed against the small of her back. She took a breath, deep and careful, before straightening and walking through the chapel doors. The service began with a hymn, voices rising in harmony that spoke of hope and salvation. But William Stone remained outside, leaning against his post, staring at the chapel doors that had closed behind Rose Harper. He stayed there until the singing stopped and the preaching began, until Reverend Thornfield's voice rang out across the town like a bell calling the faithful to prayer. And still William watched and waited, though he couldn't have said what he was waiting for. Inside the chapel, Rose sat in the back pew, alone. The wooden bench was polished smooth by years of faithful bodies, worn to a shine that reflected the colored light streaming through the simple windows. Around her, the congregation swayed gently with the rhythm of worship, their faces turned toward the pulpit where Reverend Thornfield held court. But Rose's face was turned down, her eyes fixed on her hands where they lay folded in her lap. On her knuckles were thin marks, faint as old scars but too regular to be accidental. They looked like the marks left by rope, or perhaps by fingers that gripped too tight. When she finally lowered herself fully onto the bench, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. It wasn't loud, barely more than a breath, but in the reverent quiet of the chapel, it might as well have been a shout. A few heads turned, eyes found her, and then quickly looked away, as if her pain were something indecent, something that decent people shouldn't acknowledge. Reverend Thornfield's voice never wavered, but his smile grew wider, and he spoke louder, drowning her small sound in the rising tide of his sermon. Rose pressed her lips together and forced herself to sit still, though every moment was agony. Around her the faithful nodded and murmured their agreement with the Reverend's words about patience and endurance, about the virtue of suffering in silence. Outside, William Stone finally moved. He walked to his horse, a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes and a patient temperament. He didn't mount up, just led her away from the hitching post and began walking slowly down Main Street. But he kept looking back at the chapel, at the windows that glowed warm in the morning sun, at the doors that had swallowed Rose Harper like a mouth closing around a secret. That night, long after the service had ended, and the town had settled into its evening routines. Rose sat on the floor of her attic room in the Thornfield house. The space was barely larger than a closet, with a slanted ceiling that forced her to duck when she stood near the walls. A single small window, no bigger than a book, provided the only light and air. Her bed was a thin mattress on the floor, covered with a quilt that had been beautiful once, but was now faded and worn thin as paper. A cracked water basin sat on an overturned crate that served as her washstand, and her few possessions, a brush with broken teeth, a small mirror with silver backing that had begun to peel, and a Bible with pages so worn they were soft as cloth, were arranged neatly on a shelf made from a board and two bricks. Rose sat with her arms wrapped around her legs, her chin resting on her knees. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, distant and cold as forgotten promises. The house around her was quiet except for the sounds of settling wood and the occasional murmur of voices from the rooms below. In that silence, she allowed herself to remember. She remembered her parents, her real parents, who had died when she was 14. Her father had been a gentleman who taught her to read from his one treasured book, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets that he'd carried from Virginia when he came west, seeking a new life. Her mother had been a woman of quiet strength who sang while she worked and never raised her voice in anger, no matter how difficult the day had been. They had died within a week of each other during the fever that swept through Dustwood Creek like wildfire, taking the young and old, the strong and weak, without discrimination. Rose had nursed them both, bathing their burning foreheads and spooning water between their cracked lips, praying to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from their small adobe house. When it was over, when she had buried them both in the little cemetery behind the chapel, she had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a debt to the doctor who had come too late to save them, but still expected payment for his time. That's when Reverend Thornfield had appeared like an answer to prayer. He had spoken of Christian charity, of the duty of the faithful to care for the orphaned and helpless. He had offered her a home, a purpose, a place in the community of believers. What he hadn't mentioned was the price of his charity. It had started slowly, as these things often do. A hand that lingered too long when he helped her down from the wagon. Eyes that followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. Comments about her development, her maturity, her blossoming into womanhood that made her skin crawl like she was covered in spiders. Constance had noticed, of course, but instead of protection, she offered only blame. "You're too familiar," she would hiss when her husband was out of earshot. "You encourage him with your wanton ways. A godly girl knows how to comport herself with proper modesty." The first time he came to her room, Rose had been 15 and still naive enough to believe in the goodness of men who spoke in the name of God. She had tried to resist, tried to tell Constance, tried to run. But where could a 15-year-old girl run in a territory where women without family were barely better than beasts? Now, 4 years later, she had learned the bitter lesson that many women before her had learned. That sometimes a choice isn't between right and wrong, but between survival and something worse than death. She had also learned to be quiet, to take her pain and swallow it like poison, to move through her days like a ghost haunting her own life. But today, something had been different. Today, a man had seen her pain and hadn't looked away. William Stone, the blacksmith who never spoke, had watched her with eyes that seemed to understand things that couldn't be put into words. It probably meant nothing. Men looked at women all the time, and their looking rarely led to anything but more trouble. But there had been something in his gaze, not the hungry assessment she had learned to fear, but something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he too knew what it was like to carry pain that had no name. Rose pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders and settled back against the wall. Tomorrow would bring another day of scrubbing and cleaning, of moving carefully through a world that demanded her silence. But tonight, in the privacy of her small room, she allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. Maybe someone had finally seen her. Maybe for the first time in 4 years, she wasn't completely alone. Outside her window, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the struggles of mortals below. But in a cabin at the edge of town, another soul lay sleepless, staring at those same stars and thinking about pain and silence and the terrible weight of looking away when someone needed you to see. William Stone sat on his porch in the cool night air, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The forge behind him still radiated heat from the day's work, and the scent of coal smoke clung to his clothes like incense. Around him, the desert night was alive with sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the sage. But his mind was elsewhere, caught in the memory of gray eyes and careful movements, of words whispered like prayers that no one wanted to hear. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start paying closer attention. Tomorrow he would stop being a man who watched from a distance and start being a man who acted. Because he had learned in the hardest way possible what it cost to remain silent when someone needed you to speak. In the pearl gray light before dawn, when the desert air still held the coolness of night and the mountains stood like purple shadows against the sky, William Stone was already at his forge. The ritual was always the same. Coal fed to hungry flames, bellows worked until the fire roared with white-hot intensity, the first piece of iron thrust into the heart of the blaze until it glowed like a fallen star. The work was meditation for him, the rhythm of hammer on anvil, a prayer older than words. But this morning his mind wandered despite the demands of red-hot steel. He found himself listening for sounds from the town, watching the road that led to the chapel, waiting for a glimpse of blue fabric and careful footsteps. William had been a blacksmith for nearly 30 years, since he was barely older than Rose Harper was now. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, in a lineage that stretched back to the old country where stone men had worked iron since iron was discovered. It was honest work, necessary work, and it had given him strong hands and a stronger back. It had also given him his wife. Sarah had been the daughter of a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Sumner when William was shoeing horses for the army. She had hair the color of honey and a laugh that could light up a room darker than a mine shaft. When she walked, men stopped their conversations to watch. But when she smiled at William Stone, the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. They had married in the spring of 1869, with wildflowers in her hair and promises on their lips that felt solid as the iron he shaped. Within a year, their daughter was born. Rose, named for the wild roses that grew along the creek behind their first cabin. She had her mother's honey hair and her father's steady disposition, and William thought himself the luckiest man in all the territories. The fever took them both in the winter of 1878. It started with Sarah, a cough that wouldn't go away, a tiredness that no amount of rest could cure. Within a week, it had taken their daughter too, and William found himself digging 2 graves in ground, frozen hard as stone, his tears freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. He had spoken at their funeral, said the words that needed saying about love and loss and the hope of reunion in a better place. But when they lowered those 2 pine boxes into the earth, he lowered his voice with them. What was the point of words when words couldn't save the people you love most? Now, 15 years later, watching another Rose move through her days with careful, painful grace, William felt something stirring in the ashes of his heart. It wasn't love. He wasn't fool enough to mistake compassion for romance. But it was something equally dangerous, the desire to protect, to shield, to stand between harm and someone who couldn't defend herself. He knew what that desire had cost him before. He also knew he couldn't ignore it again. Across town, Rose was already awake, though the sun hadn't yet painted the eastern mountains with gold. She lay on her thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the house coming to life below her. Constance was in the kitchen, her footsteps sharp and efficient as she prepared breakfast. Soon the Reverend would wake, and the day would begin in earnest. Rose's body ached in the particular way that had become familiar over the years. Not the clean pain of honest work or accidental injury, but something deeper and more poisonous. It was the kind of pain that lived in your bones, that colored every movement and tainted every breath. The kind of pain that decent people didn't talk about, because talking about it meant acknowledging that such things happened in their clean, God-fearing community. She rose carefully, as she always did, and washed her face in the basin of cold water she had brought up the night before. The mirror showed her a young woman who looked older than her 19 years, pale skin that rarely saw sunlight, dark circles under eyes that had seen too much, hair that hung limp and lifeless around a face that had forgotten how to smile. But in the gray morning light, she thought she saw something else in her reflection. A spark, perhaps, or maybe just the ghost of the girl she used to be. Yesterday, a man had looked at her and seen her pain. He hadn't tried to explain it away or pretend it didn't exist. He had simply seen her, really seen her, for the first time in years. It was dangerous to hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that would only make her more vulnerable. But as she dressed in her worn blue dress and pinned her hair back with the care of someone who had learned that untidiness brought punishment, Rose found herself thinking about brown eyes that watched without judgment, about a man who worked in fire and iron and understood the weight of silence. Downstairs, Constance was waiting with a list of chores that would fill the day from sunrise to sunset. Floors to scrub, laundry to wash, meals to prepare, and always, always the chapel steps to keep clean. Rose accepted the list without comment, as she always did, and stepped out into the morning air to begin another day of invisible labor. The town was stirring to life around her. Shop owners swept the dust from their front steps. Horses stamped and snorted at the hitching posts, and children emerged from houses like prairie dogs poking their heads up from burrows. The air smelled of wood smoke and coffee, of horses and leather, and the peculiar dusty scent of the high desert. Rose made her way to the chapel, her arms already loaded with cleaning supplies. The stone steps were cool in the morning shade, and she knelt to begin her work with the resigned efficiency of long practice. The lye soap burned her already raw hands, but she had learned not to cry out, not to show any sign of discomfort that might draw unwanted attention. As she worked, she became aware of sounds from across the street, the ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of hot metal meeting water, the occasional soft nickering of a horse. William Stone was at his forge, beginning his own daily labor. She didn't look up, but she felt his presence like warmth from a distant fire. The morning proceeded as mornings always did in Dustwood Creek. People came and went about their business, nodding to their neighbors and exchanging the kind of pleasant conversation that kept a community bound together. But Rose noticed that several of the women who passed gave her sideways glances, their expressions holding something that hadn't been there before. Sister Abigail stopped on her way to the general store, her sharp eyes taking in Rose's position on the chapel steps. "You look peaked, child," she said, though her tone suggested that looking peaked was some kind of moral failing. "Perhaps you need more fresh air. Too much time indoors can make a girl sickly." Rose kept scrubbing. "Yes, ma'am." "Of course, some folks are just naturally delicate, can't help their constitution." Sister Abigail's voice carried just far enough to reach the other women who had paused to listen. "Poor thing probably takes after her mother's side. I remember her people always complaining about one ailment or another." Rose's hands stilled for just a moment. Her mother had been the strongest woman she'd ever known, working from dawn to dusk without complaint, singing while she tended their small garden, never speaking an unkind word about anyone. But the dead couldn't defend themselves, and Rose had learned long ago that defending them only brought more trouble. "Yes, ma'am," she said again. Sister Abigail sniffed and continued on her way, but not before shooting another meaningful look at the other women. The message was clear. Rose Harper was sickly, delicate, prone to complaints and weakness. If she cried out in pain during church services, it was because of poor breeding and a weak constitution, not because of anything that decent people needed to concern themselves with. Across the street, William Stone set down his hammer and walked to the edge of his property. He couldn't hear the words being spoken, but he could read the body language well enough. He had seen wolves circle wounded prey with the same casual cruelty, the same assumption that weakness justified whatever came next. When Sister Abigail and her companions finally moved on, William found himself walking across the street. He didn't plan it, didn't think about what he was going to say or do. He simply found himself standing at the edge of the chapel courtyard, looking down at Rose where she knelt on the steps. She looked up when his shadow fell across her work, and for a moment their eyes met again. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the careful way she held herself, the fine tremor in her hands that spoke of pain held too long in check. "You all right?" he asked quietly. The question was simple, but it hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither of them was sure they should cross. Rose looked around quickly, checking to see if anyone was watching, then back at William's weathered face. "I'm fine," she said, the automatic response of someone who had learned that honesty was dangerous. William nodded slowly. He didn't believe her, and something in his expression said he knew she didn't expect him to. But he didn't press, didn't try to force confidences that weren't freely given. "You don't have to be," he said instead. "Fine, I mean. You don't have to be fine if you're not." It was a simple statement, but it hit Rose like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had given her permission not to be fine? When was the last time someone had acknowledged that she might have reasons for not being fine, and that those reasons might be valid? Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. Crying in public was dangerous, a sign of weakness that would only bring more trouble. "I should get back to work," she said. William nodded again. "So should I." But he didn't move immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a piece of hard candy wrapped in waxed paper. He set it on the step beside her cleaning bucket. "My wife used to say that sometimes a little sweetness makes the bitter go down easier," he said. Then he turned and walked back across the street to his forge. Rose stared at the candy for a long moment, hardly daring to believe it was real. Such a small thing, a penny's worth of sugar and flavoring, but it felt like a fortune, like proof that someone in the world thought she deserved a moment of sweetness. She looked around again, making sure no one was watching, then quickly unwrapped the candy and slipped it into her mouth. It was lemon-flavored, bright and clean on her tongue, a taste of summer sunshine in the gray morning of her life. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rose smiled. The smile didn't last long. It couldn't. Not in a place where joy was suspicious and kindness was questioned, but for just a moment, as the candy dissolved slowly on her tongue, Rose remembered what it felt like to be someone worth caring about. Across the street, William had returned to his work, but he found it hard to concentrate. The image of Rose's face when she tasted the candy stayed with him. Surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been hope flickering across her features like sunlight through clouds. He had acted on impulse, following an instinct he thought he had buried with his wife and daughter. It was dangerous to get involved, dangerous to care about someone else's pain when there was so little he could do to ease it. But as he shaped iron in the fire, William found himself thinking about another Rose, about promises made and broken, about the cost of silence when someone needed you to speak. By midday, the story of William Stone's conversation with Rose Harper had made its way through Dustwood Creek's efficient gossip network. The details grew with each telling. He had been seen talking to her, giving her something, standing closer than proper for a man speaking to an unmarried girl. In the general store, Sister Abigail held court with the other church women, her voice pitched just low enough to suggest importance, while remaining loud enough to carry to every corner of the building. "I'm not saying there's anything improper going on," she said, though her tone suggested exactly the opposite. "But a man like William Stone, living alone all these years, well, it's not natural. And that girl living in poor Reverend Thornfield's house, taking advantage of Christian charity, some might say she's not showing proper gratitude." "What do you mean?" asked Sister Ruth, though her eager expression suggested she already knew. "I mean," Sister Abigail lowered her voice conspiratorially, "that a girl who makes a scene in church, crying out like she's in mortal agony, might be the kind of girl who seeks attention from men, particularly men who don't know better." The women exchanged meaningful looks, and Rose's fate was sealed with the efficiency of a hanging judge's gavel. By evening, half the town would believe that she was a scheming seductress trying to ensnare the grieving blacksmith, while the other half would think she was a hysterical girl whose moral character was questionable at best. Neither version of the story included the possibility that she might simply be a young woman in pain who had received a moment of human kindness from someone who recognized suffering when he saw it. That afternoon, when Rose returned to the Thornfield house to help prepare dinner, she found Constance waiting for her in the kitchen. The older woman's face was set in lines of righteous disapproval, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "I've been hearing interesting stories about you today," Constance said without preamble. Rose set down her basket of cleaning supplies and folded her hands in front of her. She had learned to present as small a target as possible when Constance was in one of her moods. Yes, ma'am. Don't take that innocent tone with me, girl. Sister Abigail saw you talking to that blacksmith this morning. Saw him give you something too. Care to explain what business you have consorting with men while you're supposed to be working? Rose's hand moved unconsciously to her mouth, where the taste of lemon still lingered faintly. He asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. He gave me a piece of candy. Candy? Constance's voice dripped with disgust. And what did you do to earn this candy? What did you say to make him think you were the kind of girl who accepts gifts from strange men? Nothing. I didn't do anything. Don't lie to me. Constance's voice rose, and she took a step closer to Rose, her face flushing with anger. I know your type, girl. I've seen it before. You think because you bat your eyes and put on that helpless act, men will come running to rescue you. Well, let me tell you something. William Stone is a decent man, and I won't have you corrupting him with your wanton ways. Rose stared at her in bewilderment. I didn't bat my eyes. I didn't do anything. He just... The slap came without warning, Constance's palm connecting with Rose's cheek with a sound like a gunshot. Rose's head snapped to the side and she stumbled backward, one hand flying to her burning face. You will not speak back to me, Constance hissed, and you will not shame this household by throwing yourself at men like some common strumpet. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am, Rose whispered, tasting blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. Good. Now get upstairs and stay there until dinner, and think about what kind of girl you want to be. One who honors the family that's taken her in, or one who ends up on the streets where she belongs. Rose climbed the stairs to her attic room on shaking legs, each step feeling like a mountain to climb. Behind her, she could hear Constance muttering under her breath about ungrateful children and the burden of Christian charity. When she reached her small room and closed the door behind her, Rose finally allowed herself to collapse onto her thin mattress. The burning in her cheek was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. For a few brief hours, she had allowed herself to believe that someone might care about her well-being, that someone had seen her pain and offered comfort. But now she understood the truth. Even the smallest kindness came with a price, and that price was always higher than she could afford to pay. She touched her swollen lip gingerly and tasted copper. Tomorrow she would have to face the town with the mark of Constance's hand on her face, and everyone would know that she had been punished for something. They wouldn't ask what that something was. In Dustwood Creek, people minded their own business, and a man's right to discipline his household was sacred. Even if that household included a girl who wasn't really his daughter, who had nowhere else to go, and who had committed no greater sin than accepting a piece of candy from a lonely man who had shown her a moment's kindness. As the afternoon wore on and the sun slanted through her small window, Rose curled up on her side and closed her eyes. She tried to remember the taste of the lemon candy, the brief sweetness that had made her smile. But all she could taste now was blood and the bitter knowledge that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, at the edge of town, William Stone worked late into the evening, his hammer ringing against iron with unusual intensity. He couldn't shake the image of Rose's face when she had smiled, just for that one moment, like a flower opening to sunlight. It had been so brief, so fragile, but it had shown him the girl she might have been in a different world, under different circumstances. He had given away the last piece of candy his wife had made before she died, saved all these years in a tin on his kitchen shelf. He wasn't sure why he had done it, what impulse had driven him to cross that street and speak to a girl he barely knew. But seeing her smile, seeing that glimpse of the person hidden beneath layers of pain and caution, had felt like the first good thing he had done in 15 years. Now he wondered if he had made things worse for her. Small towns had long memories and sharp tongues, and he knew how quickly kindness could be twisted into something ugly. But it was too late to take it back, and he found he didn't want to. For the first time since he had buried his family, William Stone felt a purpose beyond mere survival. Tomorrow, he decided, he would pay closer attention. Tomorrow he would start asking questions that decent people didn't ask. Because he had learned in the hardest way possible what happened when good people chose to look away. 3 days passed before Rose appeared in public again, and when she did, the bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green that makeup couldn't quite hide. She moved even more carefully than usual, her head down, her voice barely above a whisper when forced to speak. The message was clear to anyone who bothered to look. Step out of line, and this is what happens. But most people in Dustwood Creek had learned long ago not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. Sister Abigail saw the bruise, of course. Little escaped her sharp eyes. But she only pursed her lips and nodded with satisfaction. Some children need a firm hand, she murmured to her companions. Spare the rod, spoil the child, as the good book says. The other women murmured their agreement, though a few cast sideways glances at Rose's battered face and felt something uncomfortable twist in their stomachs. But discomfort was easily pushed aside, especially when the alternative was admitting that something might be very wrong in the house of their spiritual leader. William Stone saw the bruise too, and his reaction was entirely different. He was shoeing a horse for Tom Bradley, the owner of the general store, when Rose walked past on her way to the chapel. The morning sun caught the discolored skin on her cheek, highlighting the finger-shaped marks that someone with experience reading violence could easily identify. William's hand stilled on the horse's hoof, and something cold and hard settled in his chest. He had seen marks like that before, in the army, on the faces of soldiers who had spoken out of turn or failed to show proper respect to their superiors. He had seen them on the faces of women in frontier towns, women whose husbands believed that a firm hand was the key to a peaceful household. He had never seen them on his Sarah's face, because he had never raised his hand to her, but he knew what they meant. Someone had hit Rose Harper hard enough to leave marks that lasted for days. Something wrong, Stone? Tom Bradley asked, noticing that the blacksmith had gone perfectly still. William released the horse's hoof and straightened slowly. His dark eyes followed Rose as she disappeared into the chapel, her movements careful as someone walking on broken glass. No, he said quietly. Nothing wrong. But there was everything wrong, and William knew it with a certainty that cut through him like cold steel. A young woman didn't get bruises like that from a fall or an accident. She got them from someone who believed they had the right to mark her flesh with their displeasure. Tom Bradley followed his gaze and shrugged. That Harper girl's always been trouble. Too proud for her own good, if you ask me. Reverend and his wife have been saints, taking her in like they did. Not many would have bothered. William said nothing, but his jaw clenched so hard that a muscle jumped in his cheek. He finished shoeing Tom's horse in silence, took his payment, and watched the storekeeper ride away. Then he stood in the shade of his forge and stared at the chapel, where Rose Harper was no doubt scrubbing floors or washing windows or performing some other act of penance for the sin of existing. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of routine work. Horseshoes to be shaped, tools to be mended, metal to be bent to human will. But William's mind was elsewhere, caught in memories he had tried for years to forget. He thought about his time in the war, about the things he had seen men do to each other when they believed might made right. He thought about the women who had followed the army, camp followers and officers' wives alike, and how some of them had worn long sleeves in summer and powder thick enough to hide more than just wrinkles. Most of all, he thought about his own daughter, his Rose, and how her trust in him had been absolute. She had never flinched when he reached for her, never cringed away from his voice, never looked at him with the kind of wariness he saw in Rose Harper's eyes, because he had never given her reason to fear him. What kind of man made a young woman afraid to accept a piece of candy? The answer to that question was one that decent people in Dustwood Creek didn't want to hear, but William had spent 15 years in silence, and silence had become a luxury he could no longer afford. That afternoon, he made a decision that would change everything. Rose was in the chapel cemetery, tending to the graves as she did every Wednesday. It was peaceful work that took her away from the house and the constant scrutiny of Constance's sharp eyes. She moved among the weathered headstones with a watering can and a handful of wildflowers, refreshing the arrangements and pulling weeds from the sandy soil. Her parents were buried here, in the newer section where the plots were marked with simple wooden crosses rather than elaborate stone monuments. She saved their graves for last, kneeling beside them with the last of her flowers and whispering the words she could never say aloud. "I'm sorry, Mama," she murmured, arranging purple lupines and yellow black-eyed Susans around her mother's cross. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. The wind stirred the flowers and carried her words away into the vast emptiness of the desert. Above her, hawks circled on thermals rising from the sun-baked ground, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of children playing. She would have understood. Rose spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. William Stone stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his expression gentle but serious. She hadn't heard him approach. The man moved like a ghost when he wanted to, and his sudden appearance left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. I'm sorry, he said quickly, seeing her distress. I didn't mean to startle you. I was visiting my own folks. He nodded toward the older section of the cemetery, where two matching headstones stood side by side under a mesquite tree. Rose followed his gaze and saw the names carved into the weathered granite. Sarah Elizabeth Stone, beloved wife and mother, and Rose Marie Stone, precious daughter. Both had died in the same year, and there were fresh flowers on both graves. You named your daughter Rose, she said softly, after the wild roses that grew by our first cabin. She was about your age when the fever took her. William's voice caught slightly and he cleared his throat. She would have understood what it's like to carry pain that no one wants to hear about. Rose looked down at her hands clasped tightly around the empty watering can. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. William stepped closer, close enough that she could see the kindness in his brown eyes, the lines carved by years of grief and solitude. And I think you know that I know too. For a moment they stood in silence among the graves of the dead, two living people sharing the weight of secrets that the living preferred to ignore. Rose felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Hope, or maybe just the desperate desire to tell someone, anyone, the truth about her life. They'll say I'm lying, she whispered finally. They'll say I'm ungrateful, or wicked, or trying to cause trouble for a good man. Maybe they will, William agreed, but that doesn't make it less true. Rose looked up at him then, really looked, and saw something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not pity, which she had learned to hate, but understanding. The recognition of one person who had suffered looking at another person in pain. Why do you care, she asked. You don't even know me. William was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Rose's bruised face and the graves of his wife and daughter. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. Because I know what it's like to lose someone you should have protected. And I know what it's like to live with that failure every day for the rest of your life. He looked directly at her, and she saw the truth of his words written in the depths of his eyes. I can't save my Rose. She's been gone 15 years. But maybe I don't have to watch another Rose suffer in silence. The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Rose felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She had learned not to cry, had trained herself out of that weakness years ago. You don't understand, she said. He's not just anyone. He's the Reverend. He's the most respected man in town. If I said anything against him, then we'd have to make sure we had proof, William said quietly. Evidence that even the most faithful couldn't ignore. Rose stared at him in shock. We? If you want my help, William said, I'm not going to force anything on you, and I'm not going to make decisions for you. But if you want someone to stand with you, someone who believes you, I'm here. The offer was so unexpected, so impossible, that Rose felt dizzy. For 4 years, she had faced her torment alone, had carried the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. The idea that someone might be willing to share that burden, to stand beside her against the most powerful man in Dustwood Creek, was almost too much to comprehend. Why, she asked again, because she needed to understand. Why would you risk everything for someone like me? William smiled then, and it transformed his weathered face completely. For a moment, she could see the man he had been before grief carved away everything soft. The father who had loved his daughter enough to name her after flowers. Because everyone deserves someone to stand with them, he said simply, and because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. I've spent 15 years taking the easy way, keeping my head down and my mouth shut. Maybe it's time I remembered how to fight for something that matters. Rose felt something crack open inside her chest, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. For the first time in 4 years, she wasn't alone. For the first time since her parents died, someone was offering to fight for her instead of demanding that she be grateful for whatever scraps of mercy they chose to throw her way. "What would we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'd be careful," William said. "We'd be smart. And we'd make sure that when the time came to speak, people would have no choice but to listen." Rose looked down at her parents' graves, at the simple wooden crosses that marked the resting place of two people who had loved her unconditionally. What would they want her to do? What would they say if they knew the price of the sanctuary that had been offered to their orphaned daughter? When she looked up again, her decision was made. It might be the wrong choice. It might destroy her completely. But it was her choice to make. And for the first time in 4 years, she was choosing to fight back. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we need to do." William nodded, and something shifted in the air between them, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. In the distance, a church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayers. But in the cemetery, among the graves of the dead, two living people had just declared war on the lies that kept Dustwood Creek's carefully ordered world intact. The battle for Rose Harper's freedom was about to begin. The plan William and Rose devised was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. They would need evidence, concrete proof that even the most devoted congregation member couldn't dismiss or explain away. They would need witnesses who were beyond reproach. And most importantly, they would need to be patient, because one mistake could destroy Rose completely and leave William branded as a madman or worse. For the next week, life in Dustwood Creek proceeded with the surface calm of a pond hiding dangerous currents underneath. Rose continued her daily routine of cleaning in silence, but now she watched and listened with new purpose. William returned to his forge and his careful observation, but his attention had sharpened to a razor's edge. The first break came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Elizabeth Henley was the newest resident of Dustwood Creek, having arrived just 3 months earlier with her husband, who had come to manage the Territorial Bank's new branch office. She was young, well-educated, and utterly unprepared for the complex web of relationships and unspoken rules that govern small frontier communities. More importantly, she was an outsider, which meant she saw things that longtime residents had trained themselves not to notice. Mrs. Henley had been raised in Boston, where she had attended rallies for women's suffrage and listened to speakers who talked about the rights of working women and the evils of child labor. She recognized the signs of abuse when she saw them, having volunteered at a settlement house where such knowledge was unfortunately necessary. When she saw Rose Harper's latest bruise, this one on her wrist in the distinct pattern of fingerprints, she didn't shrug it off as the result of clumsiness or delicate constitution. She sought out William Stone. "Mr. Stone," she said, approaching his forge on a bright Thursday morning, "I wonder if I might have a word with you about a matter of some delicacy." William looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping, taking in Mrs. Henley's serious expression and the careful way she glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Ma'am, I understand you've shown some concern for the welfare of Miss Harper," she said directly. "I believe we may share similar observations about her circumstances." It was a careful way of saying what couldn't be said outright, and William understood immediately. Here was an ally he hadn't expected, someone with education and social standing, who couldn't be dismissed as easily as a grieving blacksmith with a reputation for eccentricity. "What kind of observations?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Henley glanced around again, then stepped closer to the forge where their conversation would be masked by the sound of the fire and the general noise of the street. "I've seen marks on that young woman that could only have come from deliberate violence," she said in a low voice. "I've also observed her behavior, the way she flinches from sudden movements, the care with which she chooses her words, the look in her eyes. I worked in Boston with women who bore similar signs, and I know what they indicate." William set down his hammer and gave Mrs. Henley his full attention. "You willing to say that publicly?" "If necessary, yes. But I think we need more than my testimony alone. The people of this town have known the Reverend for 20 years. They've known me for 3 months. Whom do you think they believe? It was a fair point, and William nodded grimly. Then we need someone else, someone they can't ignore, or we need to catch him in the act. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. What Mrs. Henley was suggesting was dangerous beyond measure, not just for them, but for Rose. If they were wrong about the timing, if their plan went awry, the consequences would fall heaviest on the girl they were trying to protect. That's a hell of a risk, William said. Living with a predator is also a hell of a risk, Mrs. Henley replied, and it's a risk she faces every single day. William thought about that as he returned to his work and Mrs. Henley went about her business. The woman was right. Rose was already in danger, had been in danger for years. The question wasn't whether to take risks, but whether to take the kind of calculated risk that might finally put an end to her suffering. That evening he found Rose in the cemetery again, tending to graves in the gathering dusk. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he was struck again by how thin she had become, how the spark of life in her eyes had dimmed to barely a flicker. "We may have help," he told her quietly, and explained about his conversation with Mrs. Henley. Rose listened in silence, her face showing no emotion. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at her parents' graves as if seeking their counsel. "She wants to catch him," Rose said finally. It wasn't a question. "It's one possibility, but only if you're willing, and only if we can figure out a way to do it safely." Rose laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Safely? There's nothing safe about my life, Mr. Stone. There hasn't been for 4 years. Then we'll try to change that." She looked at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not hope exactly, but a kind of grim determination. The look of someone who had nothing left to lose. "What would I have to do?" William had been thinking about that ever since his conversation with Mrs. Henley. The plan would require careful timing, reliable witnesses, in a way to ensure Rose's safety, even if everything went wrong. "We'd need to know when he comes to you. We'd need Mrs. Henley and at least one other witness positioned where they could see and hear what happens. And we'd need some way to make sure you could get away if things went bad." Rose was quiet again, considering. When she spoke, her voice was steady but very soft. "He comes on Saturday nights, usually, after the evening service, when the house is quiet and his wife has taken her laudanum for her headaches. He says it's our special time for prayer and reflection." The bitter irony in her voice made William's hands clench into fists. He forced himself to relax, to think tactically rather than emotionally. "Saturday night," he repeated. "That's 3 days from now?" "Yes." "You sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Even if we succeed, your life in this town will never be the same." Rose looked down at her hands, at the fading bruises on her wrists, at the calluses from years of unpaid labor. Then she looked at her parents' graves, and finally back at William. "My life in this town has never been my own," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to find out what it would feel like if it was." William nodded, feeling a mixture of admiration and terror for this young woman who was willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. "Then we'll do it. Saturday night." As they walked back toward town in the gathering darkness, neither of them spoke about the dangers they were courting or the ways their plan could go catastrophically wrong. They had made their decision, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Behind them, the cemetery settled into the stillness of the desert night, where the dead kept their secrets and the living prepared to reveal theirs. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Rose went about her usual duties with mechanical precision, while inside her mind raced through every possible scenario, every way the plan could succeed or fail. William threw himself into his work with unusual intensity, the ring of his hammer against iron echoing through the town like a countdown to Judgment Day. Mrs. Henley made her own preparations, quietly positioning herself to observe the Thornfield house and noting the patterns of activity in the neighborhood. She also took it upon herself to seek out other allies, approaching the few women in town who might be willing to listen to uncomfortable truths. She found one in Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the only female physician in 3 counties, who had recently arrived to establish a practice serving the isolated communities scattered across the territory. Dr. Mitchell had seen enough brutalized women to recognize the signs, and she had the medical knowledge to document injuries in ways that even skeptics would find hard to dismiss. "You're certain about this?" Dr. Mitchell asked when Mrs. Henley explained the situation. "The allegations you're making are serious enough to destroy a man's life." "I'm certain that a young woman is being systematically abused and that the community is choosing to look the other way," Mrs. Henley replied. "Whether that's serious enough to act upon is a question of conscience." Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, thinking of all the women she had treated over the years. Women with injuries that didn't match their explanations. Women who flinched when their husbands entered the room. Women who begged her not to report what she had seen because they had nowhere else to go. "What do you need me to do?" By Friday evening, the pieces were in place. Mrs. Henley would position herself in the garden behind the Thornfield house, where she could see into Rose's attic room through the small window. Dr. Mitchell would wait at the nearby medical office, ready to examine and document any evidence of assault. William would be stationed across the street, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough away to avoid being seen as a conspirator before the fact. Most importantly, they had arranged for Sheriff Wade Coleman to be available, not as part of the conspiracy, but as someone who could be summoned quickly if circumstances required immediate action. The sheriff was a complication none of them felt entirely comfortable with. Coleman was an honest man, but he was also practical, and he understood the delicate balance of power that kept small communities functioning. He wouldn't act on rumors or accusations, but he might be willing to respond to undeniable evidence. Saturday arrived with the leaden weight of an executioner's axe. The morning service proceeded as usual, with Reverend Thornfield delivering a sermon about forgiveness and the importance of keeping family matters private. Rose sat in her usual place at the back, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of careful neutrality. But William, watching from outside, could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing seemed forced and deliberate. She was terrified, and she had every right to be. After the service, Rose helped Constance prepare the Sunday meal, moving through the familiar routine with automatic precision. The afternoon dragged by with painful slowness, each hour bringing them closer to the moment when everything would change, one way or another. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened across Dustwood Creek, the conspirators took their positions. Mrs. Henley slipped into the garden behind the Thornfield house, concealing herself among the vegetables and late-blooming flowers. Dr. Mitchell settled into her office, her medical bag ready and her statement forms prepared. William positioned himself across the street, where he could see both the front and back of the house. The evening service came and went. The congregation dispersed to their homes, families gathered for quiet Saturday evening meals, and Dustwood Creek settled into the peaceful routine of a frontier community at rest. In the Thornfield house, Constance took her usual dose of laudanum and retired to her room. The Reverend stayed in his study for another hour, preparing for the next day's sermon, before finally climbing the stairs to the second floor. Rose waited in her attic room, dressed in her nightgown, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had left the door unlocked, as always. She had trimmed the wick of her lamp so that it cast just enough light to see by. She had done everything exactly as she had done it for 4 years. Except this time, people were watching. This time, when Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield climbed the final flight of stairs to Rose Harper's room, he wasn't climbing into darkness and silence. He was climbing toward the light of justice, and the sound of his footsteps on those stairs would echo through Dustwood Creek for years to come. The sound of footsteps on the stairs came at exactly 11:30, just as Rose had predicted. Slow, deliberate steps that paused at each landing, as if the climber was savoring the anticipation of what waited above. Rose sat perfectly still on her narrow bed, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white as bone. Outside her small window, Mrs. Henley crouched among the shadows of the garden, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give her away. From her position, she had a clear view into Rose's room, where the girl sat silhouetted against the lamplight like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. Across the street, William Stone stood motionless as carved granite, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. He had positioned himself where he could see the back of the house, and the faint glow from Rose's window was like a beacon in the darkness. In her medical office 2 blocks away, Dr. Mitchell waited with the patience of someone accustomed to emergencies that came in the dark hours when decent people were asleep. Her bag was packed, her examination forms ready, her statement prepared. Whatever evidence they gathered tonight would be documented with the cold precision of science and medicine. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. Rose heard the familiar creak of the floorboard outside her door, the one that always announced his arrival. Her breathing grew shallow and she had to fight the urge to run, to throw herself out the window rather than endure what was coming. But she had endured it for 4 years. She could endure it for one more night. The last night, if their plan worked. The door opened without a knock. It never knocked. Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield stepped into the small room, filling the space with his presence. In the lamplight, his silver hair gleamed like a halo, and his face wore the expression of benevolent concern that had fooled an entire community for decades. He was still dressed in his Sunday clothes, though he had loosened his collar and removed his coat. "Good evening, Rose," he said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when counseling the bereaved or comforting the sick. "I hope you're feeling better today. I noticed you seemed troubled during the service." Rose kept her eyes fixed on her hands. "I'm fine, Reverend." "I'm glad to hear that. You know how I worry about you, child. You're so precious to me, so important to our little family." He moved closer, and Rose couldn't help the way her body tensed. "I've been thinking about you all day, praying for your spiritual welfare." Outside, Mrs. Henley pressed herself closer to the window, her stomach churning at the predatory gentleness in the man's voice. She had heard that tone before, from men who believed their position gave them the right to take whatever they wanted from those under their power. "I brought you something," the Reverend continued, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small cloth bag, the kind used to hold penny candy or small treats. "Sweets for my sweet girl, a reward for your faithful service." Rose recognized the ritual, the gifts that came before the demands, the kindness that was meant to make her complicit in her own violation. She accepted the bag with trembling fingers, as she always did. "Thank you, Reverend. You're so grateful, Rose, so much more appreciative than some young ladies might be. That's one of the qualities I treasure most about you." He sat down on the bed beside her, the mattress dipping under his weight. "Do you know how special you are to me?" "Yes, Reverend. I don't think you do. I don't think you understand how rare it is to find a young woman with your particular qualities. Your willingness to serve, your acceptance of guidance, your understanding of the special relationship between a spiritual shepherd and his most devoted lamb." His hand came to rest on her knee, and Rose had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. Through the window, Mrs. Henley saw the gesture and felt bile rise in her throat. The man's words were carefully chosen, designed to sound like spiritual mentorship to anyone who might overhear, but his actions told a different story entirely. "You know, Rose," the Reverend continued, his hand beginning to move slowly upward, "there are some in this town who question your character. They say you're too familiar with men, too quick to seek attention from those who might not understand your true nature the way I do." Rose's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "That blacksmith, for instance. William Stone. I've heard he's been showing you kindness, giving you gifts. Some might interpret such behavior as inappropriate." His fingers traced patterns on her leg through the thin fabric of her nightgown. "But I understand the truth. I know that you're simply a young woman in need of guidance, in need of a firm hand to keep you on the righteous path." The threat was clear, wrapped in spiritual language, but unmistakable in its intent. Rose was to understand that any kindness shown to her by others would be seen as evidence of her own moral failing, and that protection could be withdrawn as easily as it had been given. "I would never do anything inappropriate," Rose whispered. "Of course you wouldn't. Not intentionally. But young women don't always understand the effect they have on men. That's why you need someone who cares about your spiritual welfare to help you navigate these dangerous waters." His hand moved higher, and Rose closed her eyes, trying to disappear inside herself the way she had learned to do. "Someone who can teach you the proper way to express gratitude for the blessings you've received." Outside, Mrs. Henley had heard enough. She understood now why Rose had been trapped for so long, how the Reverend used his position and his carefully crafted words to make his victim complicit in her own abuse. The girl wasn't just being physically violated, she was being psychologically manipulated, made to believe that she was somehow responsible for the attention she received, that resistance would only bring worse consequences. But Mrs. Henley also understood that they now had what they needed. The Reverend's words, spoken in the confidence of his private domain, revealed his true nature clearly enough for any reasonable person to understand. She began to move quietly through the garden, making her way toward the front of the house where William waited. It was time to bring this nightmare to an end. Inside the room, Reverend Thornfield's voice had dropped to a whisper, his words becoming increasingly explicit as his hands became more aggressive. Rose endured it as she always had, by retreating somewhere deep inside herself where his touch couldn't reach. But this time was different. This time, she knew that people were watching, that evidence was being gathered, that her suffering might finally serve a purpose. "You're trembling," the Reverend observed, his voice full of false concern. "Are you cold, my dear? Here, let me warm you." He began to remove his shirt, and Rose knew that they had reached the point of no return. Whatever was going to happen had to happen now, before things went too far for even sympathetic witnesses to ignore. She took a deep breath and spoke the words she had been practicing for days. "Reverend Thornfield," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls and open window. "I don't want to do this anymore. Please stop." The words hung in the air like a prayer finally spoken aloud. For a moment, the Reverend froze, his hands stilling on her shoulders. In all the years he had been coming to her room, Rose had never spoken a word of protest, never given voice to her unwillingness. Her compliance had been part of what made the arrangement so perfect from his perspective. She suffered in silence, as a good Christian girl should. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice still soft, but with an edge of steel beneath the velvet. "I said please stop." Rose's voice was stronger now, carrying through the window to where Mrs. Henley crouched in the garden, memorizing every word. "I don't want to do this anymore. I want you to leave my room." The Reverend's face changed, the mask of benevolent concern slipping to reveal something cold and ugly beneath. "You don't want to do this? My dear child, I think you're confused about your position in this household." "I'm not confused. I know exactly what you've been doing to me for 4 years, and I'm telling you to stop." The slap came without warning, his palm connecting with her cheek with enough force to knock her sideways on the narrow bed. Rose cried out, not softly this time, but loud enough to wake the dead. "You ungrateful little whore," the Reverend snarled, his voice losing all pretense of spiritual guidance. "After everything I've given you, everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? With defiance? With lies?" Outside, Mrs. Henley was already moving, running through the garden toward the front of the house where William Stone waited. Behind her, she could hear Rose's voice rising in distress, and the Reverend's voice growing ugly with rage. "You want to know what happens to girls who bite the hand that feeds them?" Thornfield continued, grabbing Rose by the shoulders and shaking her hard enough to make her teeth rattle. "You want to know what becomes of ungrateful orphans who think they can make demands of their betters?" "Get your hands off me!" Rose shouted, fighting back for the first time in 4 years. Her nails raked across his face, leaving 3 parallel scratches from his temple to his jaw. The Reverend roared with pain and rage, his hand drawing back to strike her again. But before the blow could fall, the door to Rose's room exploded inward, torn from its hinges by William Stone's shoulder. The blacksmith filled the doorway like an avenging angel, his face dark with fury and his massive hands clenched into fists. Behind him came Mrs. Henley, her face pale but determined, and behind her, Sheriff Coleman, who had been fetched from his evening meal by a breathless Mrs. Henley. "Step away from her," William said, his voice deadly quiet. Reverend Thornfield spun around, his shirt hanging open, his face flushed with exertion and rage. For a moment, the tableau was frozen, the predator caught in the act, his victim cowering on the bed, and the witnesses who had seen everything. "This is a private matter," Thornfield said, trying to recover his composure and his authority. "You have no business in my home, in this girl's room. I demand that you leave immediately." "I don't think so," Sheriff Coleman said, stepping into the room with his hand resting on his gun belt. His eyes took in the scene. Rose's torn nightgown, the scratches on the Reverend's face, the obvious signs of a struggle. Looks to me like we've got a situation here that needs official attention. This girl has been my ward for 4 years, Thornfield said, straightening his shirt and trying to reassert his dignity. She's been suffering from hysteria, making wild accusations, trying to cause trouble. I was merely attempting to calm her down, to pray with her. Is that what you call it? Mrs. Henley stepped forward, her voice cutting through the Reverend's lies like a blade. Because from where I was standing, it looked like assault. It sounded like a young woman begging you to stop, and a man threatening her for refusing his advances. You were watching? Thornfield's face went white. You were spying on a private moment between a guardian and his ward? I was witnessing a crime, Mrs. Henley said firmly, and I wasn't the only one. William moved to Rose's side, carefully keeping his hands visible and his movements non-threatening. Are you hurt? He asked gently. Rose nodded, touching her swollen cheek where the Reverend had struck her. For 4 years, She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what she was trying to say. She's lying, Thornfield said desperately. She's a disturbed girl, prone to fantasy and hysteria. Ask anyone in town. They'll tell you about her episodes, her inappropriate behavior. The only inappropriate behavior I've seen tonight is yours, Sheriff Coleman said grimly. And I think we need to continue this conversation down at the jail, where we can sort out exactly what's been happening in this house. You can't arrest me on the word of a hysterical girl and a bunch of busybodies who were trespassing on my property. I can arrest you for assault, Coleman replied. I can see the marks on her face, and I've got witnesses who heard her tell you to stop and heard you threaten her when she refused. That's enough to start with. William helped Rose to her feet, wrapping his coat around her shoulders to cover her torn nightgown. She was shaking violently, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Relief, maybe, or the first tentative spark of hope. It's over, he told her quietly. Whatever happens next, it's over. As Sheriff Coleman led Reverend Thornfield away in handcuffs, the man's protests and denials echoing through the night air, the rest of Dustwood Creek began to wake up. Lights appeared in windows, doors opened, and people stepped out onto their porches to see what the commotion was about. By morning, everyone in town would know that their respected spiritual leader had been arrested for assault. By the end of the week, the whole truth would come out. 4 years of systematic abuse, covered up by a community that had chosen to look the other way rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Some would refuse to believe it, would insist that Rose was lying or that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Others would remember signs they had ignored, moments when they could have acted but chose not to see. But for Rose Harper, sitting in William Stone's kitchen as Dr. Mitchell tended to her injuries and documented the evidence of years of abuse, the opinions of others no longer mattered. For the first time in 4 years, she was free. 6 months later, Dustwood Creek was a different town. The changes had started slowly, like the first tentative green shoots of spring pushing through winter-hard ground. At first, it was just whispered conversations between women who had begun to question what they had seen and ignored over the years. Then came the formal inquiry, conducted by territorial authorities who found enough evidence to send Ezekiel Thornfield to prison for a very long time. Constance Thornfield had left town within a week of her husband's arrest, selling the house to William Stone for a fraction of its value and disappearing eastward on the next stage. Some said she had family in St. Louis. Others claimed she had simply wanted to get as far away from the scandal as possible. Either way, Dustwood Creek saw her as part of the problem, a woman who had known what was happening and done nothing to stop it. The house itself had been transformed. William had torn out the walls of Rose's tiny attic room, creating a proper bedroom with windows that actually opened and space enough for a person to stand upright. He had painted the walls a soft yellow that caught the morning sun and built shelves for the books that Rose had begun to collect. Stories of adventure and romance, poetry and history, all the words she had been hungry for during the years when reading was a luxury she couldn't afford. Rose lived there still, but as William's wife now, not his charity case. They had married in a simple ceremony performed by the new preacher, a young man from Santa Fe who understood that sometimes faith meant fighting for justice rather than preserving the peace. The wedding had been small. Mrs. Henley and Dr. Mitchell had served as witnesses, along with a handful of townspeople who had come to understand that Rose Harper was not the troubled girl they had been told she was, but a young woman of remarkable strength who had survived horrors that would have broken someone weaker. The marriage had surprised some people, though not those who had watched William and Rose together in the months following the trial. What they had built was not the desperate gratitude of a victim for her rescuer, but a genuine partnership between two people who understood loss and had chosen to build something new from the ruins of their separate griefs. William had found his voice again, not just in speaking, but in action. He had become one of the informal leaders of the community, the man people turned to when difficult decisions needed to be made or when someone needed an advocate who couldn't be intimidated or bought. His forge had become a gathering place where problems were discussed and solutions hammered out with the same patient skill he applied to shaping iron. Rose had found her own voice as well. She had started teaching, first just the children of families who lived too far from town to attend the regular school, then gradually taking on more students as word spread that she was patient, knowledgeable, and remarkably good at helping children who struggled with their letters. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, but most importantly, she taught by example that survival was possible, that people could endure terrible things and still find reasons to hope. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and red, Rose stood in the garden behind their house, the same house where she had once been a prisoner, now transformed into a home. She was tending to the vegetables she had planted in the spring, harvesting the last of the tomatoes and peppers before the first frost could claim them. At her feet, a small dog, a stray that William had brought home one day, claiming it needed a family as much as they needed something to spoil, chased grasshoppers through the rows of corn. From the forge came the familiar ring of hammer on iron, the sound that had once marked the rhythm of William's solitary days, but now provided the soundtrack to a life shared. "Mrs. Stone!" Rose looked up to see Mrs. Henley approaching through the garden gate, her arms full of late-blooming flowers from her own yard. The friendship between the two women had deepened over the months, built on the foundation of shared courage and mutual respect. "Elizabeth," Rose said, smiling, "those are beautiful. I thought you might like them for the church social tonight. I know you're worried about the speech you're giving." Rose accepted the flowers gratefully, though her stomach tightened at the mention of the evening's event. The Territorial Women's Society had asked her to speak about her experiences, not the graphic details, but the broader message about the importance of believing victims and creating communities where people felt safe to speak their truth. It would be the first time she had spoken publicly about her ordeal, and despite all the healing that had taken place, the prospect still terrified her. "I keep thinking I'll say the wrong thing," Rose admitted, "or that no one will want to hear what I have to say." "You'll say exactly what needs to be said," Elizabeth replied firmly, "and the people who need to hear it will listen. The others, well, their opinions never mattered much anyway." It was true, Rose knew. The town had largely divided into two camps after the trial: those who supported her and understood the importance of what had been revealed, and those who preferred to believe that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion. The latter group was smaller, and growing smaller still, as more women found the courage to share their own stories of abuse and harassment that had gone unchallenged for years. "How many confirmed attendees?" Rose asked. 47 so far, including delegates from 3 other towns. Dr. Mitchell says she's had inquiries from women as far away as Albuquerque who want to know about starting similar support networks in their own communities. Rose nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and anxiety. What had started as a desire for personal justice had grown into something larger, a movement to change the way frontier communities dealt with violence against women. It was more responsibility than she had ever wanted, but she was learning that sometimes the most important work chose you rather than the other way around. "I should get these in water," she said, indicating the flowers, "and check on dinner. William promised to quit work early tonight, but you know how he loses track of time when he's got a project going." Elizabeth laughed. "Richard is the same way. Yesterday I found him in his office at 9 o'clock at night, still working on loan applications. I had to threaten to eat his dinner to get him to come home. They chatted for a few more minutes about the small domestic details that make up the fabric of married life, whose turn it was to host the next book circle, whether the Miller's new baby was settling into a regular sleeping schedule, the ongoing debate about whether Dustwood Creek needed a proper library or if the informal book-sharing network was sufficient. It was the kind of conversation Rose had once thought she would never have. The easy talk between friends who assumed that tomorrow would be better than today, that plans could be made and futures contemplated. For someone who had lived for years believing that survival was the highest aspiration she could reasonably hope for, the simple pleasure of discussing next month's social calendar felt like a daily miracle. After Elizabeth left, Rose arranged the flowers in a mason jar and set them on the kitchen table, where their bright colors caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. She had learned to notice beauty again, to take pleasure in small things that made life sweeter. It was part of the healing process that Dr. Mitchell had told her about, the gradual return of the capacity for joy. The sound of the forge had stopped, and a moment later William appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face and clothes bearing the usual evidence of his trade. He had washed his hands and arms at the pump outside, but coal dust still dusted his hair and the lines around his eyes. "How did the speech practice go?" he asked, coming to stand behind her chair and resting his hands on her shoulders. "Terrifying," Rose said honestly. "I keep forgetting parts, or saying too much, or not saying enough." "You'll be fine. You always are when it matters." Rose leaned back against his chest, taking comfort in his solid presence. William had become her anchor in ways she was still discovering, not because she was weak or dependent, but because he had shown her what it felt like to be truly supported, rather than merely tolerated. "What if I cry?" she asked. "What if I get up there and can't get through it?" "Then you cry," William said simply, "and then you keep going. That's what brave people do. They feel the fear and do what needs doing anyway." "Is that what you did, the night you came up to my room?" William was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on her shoulders. They had talked about that night many times, but the magnitude of what he had risked, not just for her, but for the principle that someone needed to stand up and say that what was happening was wrong, still took her breath away. "That night," he said finally, "I was more scared than I've ever been in my life. Scared we were wrong, scared we were right, scared of what would happen to you if we failed. But I was more scared of doing nothing and having to live with that choice for the rest of my life." Rose turned in her chair to look at him. Even after 6 months of marriage, she was still sometimes surprised by the depth of feeling in his dark eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were something precious that had been unexpectedly returned to him. "Do you ever regret it? Getting involved in someone else's troubles?" William smiled and bent to kiss her forehead. "Rose Stone, you haven't been someone else's troubles for a long time. You've been my life, my future, my reason for getting up in the morning. How could I regret that?" The words warmed her more than the afternoon sunshine, more than the flowers on the table, or the cheerful domestic chaos of their kitchen. This was what she had never dared to hope for, not just safety, but love, not just survival, but a life worth living. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rose stood before a gathering of women and a few supportive men in the town's meeting hall. The room was packed with faces she knew and others that were strange to her. Women who had traveled from other communities to hear her story, to learn from her experience, to find hope in her example. She wore her best dress, a blue wool that William had bought for her in Santa Fe, and her hair was pinned up in a style that Elizabeth had taught her. But it wasn't her appearance that held the audience's attention. It was the quiet strength in her voice as she told her story, the unflinching honesty with which she described the years of abuse and the community's failure to protect her. "I'm not here to ask for your pity," she said, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "I'm here to ask for your commitment to believe women when they tell you they're being hurt, your commitment to speak up when you see something wrong, your commitment to create communities where people feel safe to tell the truth." She talked about the signs that had been there for anyone willing to see them, about the ways that a community's silence could become complicity. She talked about the courage it had taken to finally speak up, and the way that courage had been sustained by the people who chose to stand with her rather than look away. Change doesn't happen because one person decides to be brave, she said. It happens because that one person finds others who are willing to be brave alongside them. It happens because communities decide that protecting victims is more important than protecting the reputation of those who hurt them. When she finished speaking, the applause was long and heartfelt. But more importantly, the conversation that followed lasted for hours. Women sharing their own stories, asking practical questions about how to create support networks, discussing the legal and social changes that were needed to make communities safer for everyone. Rose answered what questions she could and listened to the rest, learning that her experience, while unique in its details, was part of a larger pattern that women across the territory had been enduring in silence. The knowledge was both heartbreaking and empowering. Heartbreaking because of the sheer scope of the problem, empowering because it meant she was not alone in wanting to fight for something better. As the evening wound down and people began to drift home, Dr. Mitchell approached Rose with a proposition. "I've been thinking," she said, "about starting a formal organization. Something that could provide resources and support to women in situations like yours. We could train people to recognize the signs of abuse, create safe houses, maybe even lobby for legal changes that would make it easier to prosecute these cases." "That sounds like a big undertaking," Rose said. "It is, but I think you'd be the perfect person to help lead it. You have the experience, the credibility, and most importantly, the heart for this kind of work." Rose looked around the room at the women who were still talking in small groups, sharing stories and contact information and promises to stay in touch. She thought about the girl she had been 6 months ago, broken, silent, convinced that her suffering was simply the price of survival. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, someone who could stand in front of a room full of strangers and turn her pain into purpose. "I'll think about it," she said, though they both knew she had already made up her mind. Later that night, as she and William walked home through the quiet streets of Dustwood Creek, Rose reflected on how much her life had changed. The town looked the same adobe buildings, the same dusty streets, the same mountains standing guard in the distance. But everything else was different. "Proud of you," William said as they reached their front gate. "For what?" "For being who you are. For surviving what you survived. For turning that survival into something that can help other people." Rose looked up at the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Once, those same stars had looked down on a frightened girl who believed she had no choices, no future beyond endurance. Now they illuminated a woman who had choices, difficult choices sometimes, but choices nonetheless. "I never thought I'd have a life worth being proud of," she said. "You always did," William replied. "You just needed the chance to live it." As they climbed the steps to their porch, Rose caught sight of their reflection in the window. A man and woman walking together, their steps matched, their future shared. It was such a simple image, but it represented everything she had thought was impossible. Partnership instead of domination, love instead of fear, hope instead of mere survival. Inside, their house was warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated evidence of a life being lived rather than simply endured. Books on the shelves, flowers on the table, the dog curled up in front of the fireplace that William had built with his own hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The organization that Dr. Mitchell wanted to start, the ongoing work of healing that was never quite finished, the daily choice to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But tonight, Rose Harper Stone was home. She was safe. She was loved. And for a woman who had once believed that such things were impossible, that was miracle enough. Rose Harper's story didn't end when Reverend Thornfield was led away in chains, or when she married William Stone, or even when she stood up in that meeting hall and turned her pain into purpose. Her story continued in every woman who found the courage to speak up, in every community that chose to listen, in every person who decided that protecting the vulnerable was more important than preserving the comfortable lies that kept ugly truths hidden. Because that's how real change happens, not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but with ordinary people who decide that ordinary cruelty is no longer acceptable, with blacksmiths who choose to see rather than look away, with newcomers who refuse to accept that this is just how things are, with victims who find the strength to become survivors, and survivors who find the courage to become advocates. Rose's whisper, "It hurts when I sit," became a shout that echoed across the territory and beyond, inspiring the creation of support networks that still exist today. Her story reminds us that the most powerful words are sometimes the simplest ones. I believe you. You're not alone. This is not your fault. It has to stop. In the Wild West, justice often came from the barrel of a gun. But sometimes, just sometimes, it came from something even more powerful. The quiet determination of good people who refuse to be silent in the face of evil. Have you ever had to find the courage to speak up when no one wanted to listen? Have you witnessed someone's quiet strength in the face of impossible circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your voice matters here. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power that lies in believing survivors and standing up for those who can't protect themselves, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of courage, justice, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. Because out here in the vast landscape of human experience, there are still so many stories of hope and redemption waiting to be told. Next week, we'll bring you another story from the frontier, one that will remind you that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change the world. Until then, remember, your voice matters, your story has power, and you are never as alone as you think you are. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing that stories like Rose's matter. Because they do. They always have, and they always will.